I'll sit here. So, Martin. That was a useful conversation we had. Both come. So, org laga दें. Doesn't matter. जरा और लगा दें. We want to give people a sense of the. You want the book? यहाँ चाहिए.
नहीं. Handmade. Handmade.
Hi, I'm Namita.
Oh, yes.
Glad you made it.
No, show me the first page. This is actually potential. I did that.
So if you want to read now,
Yeah, that's right.
you should take.
That's right. Yes, Namita, we are all yours.
Oh, sorry. I was looking at the audience feeling delighted to see so many people waiting eagerly for.
Because it's free.
It takes a lot of hard work to get here, to listen in. So, dear friends, very good to see all of you here. And as you know, one of the themes of this year's festival is crime and punishment. And this is the seed session for that whole theme. And I have here Homi Bhabha. I won't use they don't need any introduction line, but they really do not. Martin Puchner and Suhel Seth. And we look together at Dostoyevsky's Crime and Punishment as a base text through which to study and understand the eternal conflicts of human existence and the nature of moral and social retribution. It's a key part of the larger strand of sessions programmed around the idea of crime and punishment. Within this series, we look at the genre of detective fiction and its late but fruitful blooming in a South Asian scenario that increasingly demands accountability and responsibility in the social fabric. And besides examining and dissecting detective fiction, including the brooding intensity of Scandinavian crime writing, which you will encounter in other sessions to come, we also look at Bollywood villains with Javed Akhtar on Khalnayaks. We look at vendetta, we look at the shadow lines between the good guys and the bad. But here today, this session will lead us through the intricacies of Dostoyevsky's classic and enduring novel, which is the psychological account of a crime, into the larger context of the theme. And we're really honored to have two people here who know both the text so well and the context of that so well. And we have with us a voice and a heart in Suhel Seth, who will be, and he will do the dramatic readings which will be broken into it. So my role is now to have a privileged part as an audience on stage. So over to the three of you.
Thank you so much, Namita. And I must say that we who in some ways represent the Mahindra Humanities Centre at Harvard, Martin, myself, but of course Suhel has also been there, and we hope you'll be there with us. We are really delighted to be here today, and so grateful to you, Namita, for suggesting this theme to us. We hope to be working together, and the idea of the contribution that the Mahindra Centre will make to the great celebration here at Jaipur will be every year to try and introduce a particular theme over a period of days, rather closely narrated together, so that people might want to develop some arguments and ideas around a particular area of work. And that's what our sort of little niche interest at this great festival is going to be. Thank you for giving us the opportunity.
So we begin now, Suhel.
Thank you, Namita. Thank you, Homi and Martin.
I'm glad I'm reading Crime and Punishment because we still have to wait for Sharad Pawar's autobiography. When that happens, I'll read that in the same context, I hope. That's not political. On an exceptionally hot evening early in July, a young man came out of the garret in which he lodged in S Place and walked slowly, as though in hesitation, towards Cambridge. He'd successfully avoided meeting his landlady on the staircase. His garret was under the roof of a high 5-storied house and was more like a cupboard than a room. The landlady who provided him with garret, dinners, and attendance lived on the floor below. And every time he went out, he was obliged to pass the kitchen, the door of which invariably stood open. And each time he passed, the young man had a sick, frightened feeling which made him scowl and feel ashamed. He was hopelessly in debt to his landlady and was afraid of meeting her. This wasn't because he was cowardly and abject, quite the contrary. But for some time past, he had been in an overstrained, irritable condition, verging on hypochondria. He'd become so completely absorbed in himself and isolated from his fellows that he dreaded meeting not only his landlady, but anyone at all. He was crushed by poverty, but the anxieties of his position had of late ceased to weigh upon him. He'd given up attending to matters of practical importance. He'd lost all desire to do so. Nothing that any landlady could do had a real terror for him. But to be stopped on the stairs, to be forced to listen to her trivial, irrelevant gossip, to pestering demands for payment, threats and complaints, and to rack his brains for excuses, to prevaricate, to lie. No, rather than that, he would creep down the stairs like a cat and slip out unseen. This evening, however, on coming out into the street, he became acutely aware of his fears. I want to attempt a thing like that, and I'm frightened by these trifles, he thought, with an odd smile. Yes, all is in a man's hands, and he lets it all slip from cowardice. That's an axiom. It would be interesting to know what it is men are most afraid of. Taking a new step, uttering a new word is what they fear most. But I'm talking too much. It's because I chatter that I do nothing. Or perhaps it is that I chatter because I do nothing. I've learned to chatter this last month, lying for days together in my den thinking of Jack, the giant killer. Why am I going there now? Am I capable of that? Is that serious? It is not serious at all. It's simply a fantasy to amuse myself. A plaything? Yes, maybe. Maybe it is a plaything. The heat in the street was terrible. And the airlessness, the bustle and the plaster, scaffolding, bricks and dust all about him, and that special Petersburg stench. So familiar to all who, unable to get out of town in summer, all worked painfully upon the young man's already overwrought nerves. The insufferable stench from the pothouses, which are particularly numerous in that part, and the drunken men whom he met continually, although it was a working day, completed the revolting misery of the picture. An expression of the profoundest disgust gleamed for a moment in the young man's refined face. He was, by the way, exceptionally handsome. Above the average in height, slim, well-built, beautiful dark eyes and brown hair. Soon he sank into deep thought, or more acutely, speaking into a complete blankness of mind. He walked along not observing what was about him and not caring to observe it. From time to time he'd mutter something from the habit of talking to himself, to which he just confessed. At these moments he would become conscious that his ideas were sometimes in a tangle and that he was very weak. For 2 days he hadn't even tasted food.
Very good.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment. Excuse my cough. I'm a little bit under the weather, and I'm in fact a little bit feverish. And so last night, as I was reading Crime and Punishment, I was cursing myself. Why am I getting sick just now, the day before the Jaipur festival? It's the worst time to get sick. And then suddenly I realized it was actually the best thing that could happen, because being feverish is really the only state of mind in which this novel can be adequately read. It's not a novel for healthy minds and healthy bodies. It's a feverish novel, one thought chasing the other. So I've come to think that it's in fact impossible to read the novel when you're healthy. One of those unhealthy thoughts that the protagonist, Raskolnikov, has is that of committing a kind of random act of murder, killing a pawnbroker whom he knows and doesn't particularly like. He commits that crime, and the rest of the novel is devoted to figuring out what the effects of this act are on his mind, his body, his life. So large part, the murder occurs relatively early in the novel, and then the rest is devoted to figuring out the psychological effects of this act of murder. It's not a perfect murder. He almost botches it. Through coincidence, he escapes. But then he feels the urge of confession. And this urge of confession dominates the rest of the novel to the very end, when we find him in a penal colony. About Dostoevsky, how to introduce Dostoevsky, there's one story that captures to my mind what sort of the essence of Dostoevsky. And that story goes like this. There's a young man who gets entangled with a group of revolutionaries. They're distributing pamphlets against the Tsar and the Russian Orthodox Church. A police spy infiltrates the group, and everyone is arrested and condemned to death. So our protagonist with his companions gets dragged onto a podium. There's a cheering crowd, and they're going to be executed by a firing squad. His name is called, he steps forward. A priest administers the last rites and induces him to confess his crimes, which he does. Then someone pulls his cap over his head. The firing squad takes aim. And the protagonist knows that this will be the last second of his life. But then someone shouts, "Long live the Tsar, the good Tsar," and a messenger arrives, bringing the pardon. The firing squad does not shoot him. He falls to his knees and pledges the rest of his life to the Tsar. Now, this is not a story by Dostoevsky. This happened to Dostoevsky in 1848 and 9. And I think this event really shaped his life and his work in two ways. One is that both his life and his fiction is one of extremes. Moderation is a term that is completely meaningless to Dostoevsky. One moment you're being shot to death, the next moment you're saved. One moment you're distributing pamphlets against the Tsar and the Russian Orthodox Church, the next moment you pledge your life to the Tsar. So this extreme volatility from going from one extreme to the other is something that was both true of Dostoevsky's life and his fiction. And the other is this theme of confession, that Dostoevsky actually at that moment on his knees confesses his crime. And I think that very much becomes central for Crime and Punishment. So this is perhaps one moment, one anecdote that really captures Dostoevsky by way of introduction.
Thank you very much, Martin. I was wondering, listening to you and also listening to the excellent reading, whether one of the reasons why this book has had such a remarkable life, a life of its own, but also a life in influencing other writers. John Coetzee is one of them. You mentioned when we were talking that Pamuk, when he gave the Norton lectures at Harvard, also mentioned Dostoevsky, although we couldn't trace exactly what the influences would be. But I think one reason why it has this is that it takes the whole issue of the conditions of crime very seriously. Why do crimes happen? What is the state of mind of the criminal? It's easy for us, either in court or in a newspaper or in conversation, to point to somebody and say, he is a criminal. But what do we know of the attendant circumstances? And if we did know the attendant circumstances, and if we knew the causes and the consequences of those, would we still use that one simple, single, accusatory word and say, this is a crime and this is a criminal? So I think the reason why the book is so translatable into other languages, into other times, is it opens up this issue for discussion. What is a crime? What is criminality? And from whose position can we make a kind of final judgment? This doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that there is no criteria whatsoever, that we live in a world of floating cultural relativism. Not at all, where everything can be excused. Not at all. I'm not suggesting that. Laws exist, courts exist, the police exists, moral criteria exist. I accept all of it. But it does complicate, at the psychological level and the moral and ethical level, how we should actually relate to this reality of crime or criminality, even if we decide to come down on one side or the other. And I think, I just say one more word and then open out to our group. And I think that one of the great things about the book is the way in which it can, over a long sustained period of time, it takes several days to go through this, how it can use plot and character but continually keep the turmoil of emotions going. So whatever you think you can rationally understand, that's always overstrung by this, as you described it, this feverish move of emotions. And I think this is something we can all identify with. We can all identify with. How often have we not said, oh, if only I could kill him? And of course we then either use it metaphorically, but in our minds, have we not assassinated a lot of people?
Every day.
There you go. I'll just leave that open to just a few thoughts to start with.
Yeah, so I'm...
when did you first, Namita, when did you first read the book? Can you...
You know, I read the book, I read a lot of Dostoyevsky, all of it when I was about 16 to 21, when I was in college. And it meant a lot to me. And then I turned the other way because I was thrown out of college. And when I was thrown out of college, I began a film magazine. And it was a different way of thinking and writing. But there were two books which I read when I was very young. One was The Outsider by Albert Camus, which I read when I was 15. And one was this, which just underlaid they threw up the middle-class Brahmanical upbringing I had had. And they just turned my life upside down. And I think that feverish description that you gave, it's the tone, it's the pace of this book. And I don't know how many in the audience may have read it and how many will now read it. But it looks at the moral universe through our deepest nightmares, really, of who we might be.
Yeah. And what we might be capable of.
Absolutely.
What we might be capable of. Suhel, what about you?
I think the question that you asked in the beginning was, we don't assess the environment in which a person commits a crime. And what is always assessed is the crime per se, which is akin to, you know, the idea or the execution. No one knows an idea is good enough unless it's executed. I think a bigger issue here is that crime is contextual, it is relative, it is geography relevant, it is caste, culture relevant. I mean, the French don't care about whether Hollande, you know, messes around on a two-wheeler. In India, all our leaders have mistresses, or at least most of them, but we're not supposed to know. So there is this cultural insulation or isolation that we keep talking about. I want to bring to the table another, what I would call an important point. The more recent case of Rajat Gupta and McKinsey being hauled up by the courts in the US. Insider trading was just the crime, but there was a greater environmental issue which is explained brilliantly in Anita Raghavan's book, The Billionaire's Apprentice, saying that he came from a background and went into a society where money was the only denominator of success. And he felt that if he could not partake of that money, even though he was advising some of these really wealthy people, he might as well get into bed with them. Now, is that criminal intent, or is that an accident of fate, or is it because you've put yourself in a position which you can't extricate yourself out of? So I would say in my book there are three kinds of crimes. The intent to commit a crime is crime enough. You know, you may fail at being a good murderer, but that doesn't deprive from the fact that you had the intent of murdering. The second is, what kind of crime constitutes moral turpitude? What kind of crime constitutes revulsion in society? Do we think Jack the Ripper was the biggest criminal of all? I don't know. Some people would assume Bernie Madoff is, where so many lives were destroyed. And the third kind of crime is, what does it tell in either a deterrent form or in the form of a lesson to the society that it is impacting at that point in time? And that's why I think this book will remain universal and timeless, because the characters can be, excuse me, the characters can be today, they can be day after tomorrow, but their environment is what breeds the intent.
And I think that this, of course, this book will remain and contain its great authority until you write your book based on those three principles that you've just given us. Then you will write Crime and Punishment Part 2, and people will read this one less often. But let me ask you something.
Mine will be a collection of biographies of our MPs, people in Parliament, just a collection.
So you see, there's such a response from the audience, and Namita, you had said this to me when we thought of Crime and Punishment, that there is a moment here in India today where there may be crimes, but what is punishment is an open question. Who gets punished and who does not get punished? And I think for Dostoevsky, if I might just go back for 1 minute before we leap forward into other issues, the issue here is, one issue is feverishness, you know, the feverishness of the act itself, and I'm using this metaphorically. The other issue is the question of confession. You know, what is confession? How do you stand as witness to yourself, leave alone as witness to something else? Yes, you were going to say something.
No, I was just saying, it's also confession. It's also, there are moments, what I remember in Dostoevsky, where there are moments of reprieve, where there is an innocence or a silence or something enters and breaks that feverishness, only to compound it even further. But I wanted to go back to what Suhel was saying, and it struck me that here 2 years ago in Jaipur, we had a writer, and I'm 90% certain of his name, but I'm not 100% certain, so I don't want to misquote him. And it was in a session on Dalit writing, and he was a Maharashtrian writer who came from a criminal, the supposed criminal tribes. And the whole book, his autobiography, was about what it was to be born into a strata of society that the British had thoughtfully named as a criminal tribe. And so when you grew up from childhood, they were actually trained on petty theft. And he had to break out of it and go to college, but also the social hierarchy where, as he was saying, where some people think it is their complete right to do what may not be construed criminal acts in their area, and in some, down the line, you ritually make some people the criminals. And this is one of the problems in Indian society, and it's delightful to see it is opening out, and accountability and culpability on a personal and individual level are coming into play somewhere, little bit.
I think somewhere, little bit. I love that. I think that's very important.
I just wanted to toss in one thing. History has the art of also reversing criminality. When he was incarcerated in Robben Island, Mandela was a criminal.
That's right.
Gandhi in South Africa was a criminal. So would you define criminality along, as you rightly said in your opening remarks, along the fine tenets of judicial accountability and judicial norms, or would you define it as something that defies the very moral fabric of an evolving or an evolved society? So, and therein lies the confession. Gandhi was willing to confess that he had committed a crime because in his mind, that crime was in order to save humanity from racism. So where do we draw the line on kinds of crime? And, you know, many people in Kashmir, when you talk to them, they say, we're not separatists, we're freedom fighters. Now, when the Indian government calls them terrorists, do we take into account the same very environment that you rightly spoke about, which makes them believe or behave the way they do?
I'm going to turn over to you in a minute, Mike, but I just want to just respond to that direct question. Absolutely right. Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan called Mandela a terrorist and warned the world and their own nations about the great political harms and the great moral harms of Nelson Mandela. You know, a year and a half later, he was a saint. Just to emphasize your point, I think the issue I want to raise here is this, and it goes back to Rajat Gupta, of which the case I'm not that familiar of, but I'm taking the case as you mention it here now. I think one of the issues, intent, of course, is extraordinarily important in this way, in the judicial apparatus too. But I think the question is, do you or do you not know better through education, through socialization or whatever, despite the circumstances within which you have been brought up? I.e., does Rajat Gupta know that this is, given where he is now, doing what he is, insider trading is a no-no. Now, he may have the urge, it may be very tempting, well then he should go to the gym or he should take a drink. But the point is, if you know it, and it's part of your professional culture, and then you go out and make a telephone call 2 minutes after you step off the Bank of America board and advise your partner to buy, that I think, I mean, you know, there are little dots there, all of them can't be joined, but that's pretty bad, irrespective of the culture within which he was brought up. Whereas I think the Dalit case is a very different case.
But I think no criminal ever believes he or she will get caught.
That's true.
That's the basic assumption with which crime is committed.
So
there's a brazenness which is part of criminality.
Yeah. Is that a part of the novel?
So it's interesting because it's interesting that there's a kind of consensus emerging here, and it's a very modern, understandable consensus that, you know, one person's crime is another person's virtue, and so on and so forth. And I think we all believe.
But unless people know in their particular area that this is wrong, and they know it.
Right. What's interesting is that this is not the case in this novel. Absolutely. Even though Dostoevsky spends so much time thinking about, so Raskolnikov is impoverished, undernourished, feverish, and all of that, and in that state commits this crime, there's never for a second doubt that it is a crime. So since the novel doesn't ask what is a crime, it doesn't explore the gray areas. When is a crime no longer a crime? Is it maybe relative, and so on and so forth? If we change society, it would all be different. No, there's a kind of religious certainty, moral certainty that this is a crime. It's a given. And then Dostoevsky is interested in what kind of state of mind produces a crime. Not what is a crime, but what kind of mind produces a crime. It's very interesting. And perhaps not modern, because we think precisely this kind of consensus that's emerged, thinking about criminality in a much more socially sophisticated way. Dostoevsky, I would say, ultimately thinks about crime in religious terms.
That's the other point I wanted to make. If you believe on the basis of a particular religious tenet, belief, custom, whatever you want to call it, that, and it's difficult to think of any religion where murder would not be seen as a crime. I mean, I can't think of a single religion where somebody, you might, in the defense of the persecution of your religion, commit a crime. I mean, you know, people always thought that the Al-Qaeda were the only, but you know, you had Christian martyrs, political martyrs, you had Jewish political martyrs, you had Hindu political martyrs. So I can understand that, you know, killing in the defense of the religion. But no religion would say somebody that, you know, is not a crime. The brilliance then of this book is that you know where the author has come down on. The values are not an issue. The brilliance of it is the generosity of the vision afterwards, to say, I know this is wrong, but let me try and understand the circumstances. And for the general question of making a decision, a deliberative decision on these difficult issues, don't you think education is extraordinarily important? The thing that brought us this book in our universities, in our colleges, and I'm sorry to use this as a platform, but I'm not sorry to use it as a platform for the huge decline in the humanities and the arts today. You know, for a talk I gave in Germany, I did a bit of research for something to do with books, which are all printed matter, which I want to share with you today. 2011, 45, I think roughly $45 billion was spent in producing junk mail, the stuff, you know, that is thrown through your door, which you then throw out. From kindergarten to 12 and secondary education on textbooks, they spent $10 billion. And I wrote a piece at that time saying, if every catalog you got for whatever thing that you were not going to buy, they'd said, give 2 pages of that catalog for a good writing. So that when you got that, you said, okay, I don't want the rest of it, but I will read a short 1-page short story. Look at the difference that we could have. 4 times more on junk mail that we take and put in the dustbin. This must say something, not only about consumer society, but about a consumer society that is radically cutting the arts and humanities. India, the major universities are in perilous trouble. In Britain, there's a 25% cut, roughly. I would be very grateful if that's a subject that we could also, on the back of this great novel, we would never have been able to read it had we not had the education we had.
You know, you talked about religion and criminality. M.J. Akbar, in a book called The Shade of Swords, defines Islam saying, jihad is not an invitation to kill, it's an invitation to die. When religion uses criminality as a supportive or as a positive and non-criminal function, they always have reasons. It was the same thing that Bhindranwale said in his speeches between October the 1st, 1981 to around September, July, whenever Blue Star was done. So there are religions that are using criminality but couching them as means of survival and in order to justify a certain moral code. I mean, you talk about the Crusaders. So I think we use criminality as a crutch. If it's inconvenient, we blame it on forces that are extraneous, just in order that the guilt doesn't stick to us. Ultimately, it's the individual who wants to perform the crime but doesn't want the guilt with it or the repercussions with it.
Well, it's interesting to use, so I totally agree, you know, reading Dostoyevsky is kind of a challenging novel and you need education and so on and so forth. So an interesting thing to use this novel as a justification for something like a humanities education, because so Raskolnikov, the protagonist, is a former student, and to some extent this is a novel of ideas, but it's a novel of terrible ideas. So it's not a novel that celebrates, you know, it's not a philosophical novel that celebrates thoughts and ideas, but it's precisely that crazy idea of just committing this murder that kind of floats into Raskolnikov's head one day and that kind of lodges in his mind and which he then executes, is seen as that's what happens to kind of an overwrought mind. And so it's interesting how negative, in a sense, the novel is about ideas. One could almost say that it's a kind of an anti-intellectual novel. Even though at the same time, it's clear that the world the novel paints is one in which ideas are important, right? People get ideas and then they go out and commit murder, or they do something else. They distribute pamphlets against the Tsar or whatnot. But I think in part because of Dostoevsky's personal experience, he gets deeply skeptical about ideas. Now, ideas is not the same thing as education, clearly. And you could say maybe, education allows you to actually form moral judgments rather than just kind of get hold of an idea. But it's an interestingly complicated
So one idea from this book, which I think really resonates with the wider political issues, because our discussion has been going from the public world into the book, to education, back into the book, is this notion of confession. You know, we talked about the fact that Mandela was turned into a saint from being a criminal almost overnight, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission,
Yes.
that institutionalization of the notion of convention, it was not entirely successful, as you well know. It's very, very controversial. Many people feel that it was the unresolved and incomplete nature of that process that has had a backlash with criminality in South Africa now, and a certain kind of moral vulnerability in the country. We can talk about that later. But confession of the values of confession in this book, I think, could be raised, the scale could be raised. They could be scaled up to talk about a moment of social meditation on what has happened, of trying to take account of what has happened. You know,
Can I
yes, please.
pick up one more point, because it may be too late in the conversation later to pick it up, and I completely agree that it's anarchy which is the theme of this novel, moral anarchy or whatever. But here, when you said education and the educational and humanities value of this book, I think the greatest thing to remember of how this book has come to us was that it was in the distinguished translation by Constance Garnett, which was so beautiful, and then so on. And how that moment in Russian literature was perpetuated by great and sympathetic translators.
Yes.
And in India, this moment, this is what we need, is that degree of translation. And I'd like to pick up what you said about junk mail. And I wish that everybody in India who bought X, Y, or Z, if they gave 2% to supporting translations from across the Indian languages for the rest of the world to the Indian languages, we would have this moment. And I want to share just it's a long story, when I can share it quickly, I'd like to share it, is that I was at a seminar where there were writers and professors and literary critics from all across the former Soviet Union. They talked about Georgian and all their languages. And in the end, a lady wearing a burqa got up and she said, in Russia, we believe the last thing is never said till the end. And what is said in the end is the most important thing. And she said, the most important thing is that the decline of the Soviet Union led to the decline of the most important literary language in the world, which is Russian. And I think here somewhere we have to pay tribute to that moment in Russian literature.
Absolutely.
Which is whether it was Tolstoy, Dostoyevsky, and the intensity with which that society examined itself through its literature in different aspects. So this might have been one searchlight at criminality and the internal criminality of a society. And that moment of literature and that moment of literary genius within this book is situated, and the translation that gave it to the rest of the world. We have to remember those things also.
I think, this is such an important issue, because when you go and speak somewhere, and you have, the translators penned up in their boxes, very few people think, when they do their acknowledgements, to actually know that without those translators, there would be no such thing as transnationality or global discourse. It just does not exist, other than the domination of one language over translation. I think the translation is very important. When we were talking about the influence of Dostoevsky, do you remember, I can't remember the name of the Woody Allen movie. I think Woody Allen has made some of the greatest movies and has made some of the really awful ones. But there is this movie which is all set around Wimbledon. No, it's set around Match Point. I don't think it's a great movie, but remember how he kills his, shoots his landlady. You know, he's coming out of he thinks, you know, well, if I just got this woman, the landlady saw him, I forget to, said, if I just shoot her, just get rid of her, you know, that'll be the end of the problem. And I was thinking as we were talking,
that was his Dostoevsky moment.
That's the Dostoevskian moment. And a moment which Woody Allen has increasingly been in the dark movies now, in the very dark movies that he's been making over the last 4 or 5 he's been thinking of. Should we open up now, do you think?
Yeah.
Is there another reading?
No,
No, there's another reading.
There is another.
It would be beautiful to do another reading and then open
quick
up.
reading, because it'll give us back to the mood of the book.
Yeah, love. Another reading? Great.
I'm just going to stand. It's very difficult. We don't do theater sitting down. He set the axe down on the floor by the dead woman and immediately put his hand into her pocket, trying not to smear himself with the flowing blood. That same right pocket from which he had taken her keys the last time. He was in full possession of his reason. The clouding and dizziness had ceased, but his hands were still trembling. He recalled afterwards that he was even very attentive, careful, tried to be sure not to stain himself. He immediately pulled out the keys. They were all in one bunch as before in a steel ring. He immediately ran to the bedroom with them. This was a very small room. There was a huge stand with icons, and against the opposite wall, a large bed, quite cleaned, covered with a silk patchwork quilt. Against the third wall stood a chest of drawers, and as soon as he heard their jingling, it was as if a convulsion ran through him. He again wanted to suddenly drop everything and leave, but only for a moment. It was too late to leave. He even grinned to himself. But then another anxious thought struck his mind. He suddenly fancied that that old woman might still be alive and might still recover her senses. Abandoning both the keys and the drawers, he ran back to the body, seized the axe, and raised it one more time over the old woman. But he didn't bring it down this time round. Thank you.
Questions? Right here in the front.
Who's got the mic, please? Yeah.
Maybe the... I can...
I think we had a good session.
Chained.
Yes.
Yeah, this is an open question to any of you. In talking about crime and punishment, my recollection from when I read it was that a large part of the definition of those two, or what connects them, is the idea of guilt and shame. Could you talk a little bit about why that's so important and what it means in the book?
That's to you.
Well, I think guilt is an interesting category because it's not a legal category, and this goes back to what Homi said earlier about confession, which is also certainly in this novel not just a legal category. It is also, in a sense, this is a crime novel, and we're trying to find out who committed the crime. So confession is a legal category, but it's also a moral and again very Christian category. And you mentioned guilt, which is of course also in the context of this novel, and it's such a Christian novel. I mean, you can't get, we have to acknowledge that. So I think this is very much part of this question of guilt, how it plays out. And I think it is this guilt that gets translated into an urge to confess. And this urge to confess is like a pressure that's there throughout the novel, and it pushes him to confess, and then he stops and thinks better, and he doesn't want to get caught, but then this pressure is constant, and it pushes further and further and further until he finally confesses his guilt. And when we find him at the end in penal colony, it's certainly seen as a kind of atonement, perhaps. But so I would single out the kind of religious or moral religious register, I think, in which this happens.
Can I just respond to that in a slightly more secular sense? That, you know, the usual definition is that guilt, for guilt there is some reparation, you know. Either in court or in church, you're guilty, say 6 Hail Marys and try not to do it again. Or whatever, you know, or in court, you know, yeah, plea bargain, yeah, that's right, court is all about. But the really interesting thing is the way in which in the literature of quote-unquote criminality, crime, guilt and shame are mixed together in a kind of Rorschach. And that's the interesting thing, that even if you get let off on the guilt end, you can't deal with the shame. Because I believe that shame is that self-preservative moment before you acknowledge your guilt, where you really don't want to be found out. You know, it's fine to be virtuous and say, I'm guilty. All right, I admit it, and I'll take the punishment. But shame is always that moment before where you say, I've done this, but has anybody seen? Oh, thank God nobody's seen, I don't have to confess it. And I don't think that moment ever doesn't happen. Certainly you have it here, but the great literary example of it, and I was talking about that, I quoted from that very book in a lecture I gave in Bombay late last evening, the great work, and I hope we can once discuss it here, is Conrad's Lord Jim.
Yes, indeed.
However much they tell him, all right, fine, by the naval laws we understand what you did, he's haunted by the shame. And whereas we have, you know, in anthropology, there's Mediterranean shame cultures as opposed to guilt cultures in the North. The great thing about literature, it's never believed in that distinction. It mixes guilt and shame continuously in the most complex moral and narrative ways. And I think that's one of the great, for me, that is one of the great justifications of what we would call a classic. A classic is not simply a novel that lives over 100 years. A classic is not a novel for me that transcends its time. A classic is a novel that is so struggling to keep up with its own history. It is so confused about its own moment that those confusions in other contexts and moments give rise to further contemplation about what is not thought through in the novel. So this kind of, you know, Apollonian idea of the perfect novel being the classic is actually not true. I think the classic is the novel that is most translatable and most, in a way, complexly discussable. And I think this is the novel of that classic moment, for that reason.
Yes, indeed.
Because it hasn't, in a way, transcended its history or its morality. It's struggling with it all the time. Another question, please. Yes. We can't take them all from the first row, but we'll have the second one for you.
And then the first row.
And then
Friend of mine.
Oh, this is our dear friend.
Yes, it is. For me, it's me. Yeah. I wanted to bring the discussion back to what was the central question, which is one of the central questions, which is what is the state of mind that produces a crime? And for a writer, how does one describe the state of mind which produces a crime? I wanted to ask you that in modernity today, you know, we distinguish between the crime passionnel and the cold-blooded murder. And these are the law distinguishes a cold-blooded murder, so does society. I wanted to know what was your feeling. We looked at a feverish description, but Truman Capote has done In Cold Blood and so on, whether you thought that one of these psychological states was more interesting, more difficult to understand for psychologists, writers, philosophers, the cold-blooded one and the crime passionnel, the feverish one, and it's addressed to, I think, more or less Martin.
Okay. It's interesting because In Crime and Punishment, from one perspective, you could say it is a dispassionate crime because there's this idea of the perfect crime that you plan in advance and you have no real motivation for, and that would be the perfect crime. That's the idea, the abstract idea that Raskolnikov conceives of. So that would be the in cold blood, right? Cold-bloodedly, I can commit this act and no one will find it out. And it will be done, and I will have done it and no one will know. So you could say that, in a sense, it starts that way, but then it doesn't sustain that because immediately the passion, the feverish mind takes over. So I don't quite, so perhaps we can also say that's the other thing that literature mixes, the cold-blooded and the feverish. At least this novel does. And I think for a novel, I suppose it would be hard to really maintain the in cold blood kind of line. Possible, maybe an interesting challenge. So that's maybe what I would say, that from one perspective you could say that Crime and Punishment shows that even if you conceive of this kind of dispassionate perfect crime, you can't sustain that because all these other processes, states of minds will kick in and will mess everything up.
One of the interesting things for this really, and you know, we say, you know, literature learns from life, and I'm saying now life learns from literature. On the cold-blooded or the crime passionnel, it also depends very much on the characters. Yep. You know, if there's, you know, if the crime passionnel is committed by some, you know, somebody who brutishly picks up a gun and shoots his wife's lover, right. You know, the guy is brutish. But if it's taken by somebody who is deeply romantic, then it's a different matter. Nanavati. Yeah, Nanavati case.
There's a very famous lawyer in the front row, internationally famous lawyer, Steen Lassen, and he had a question. I'm curious to know what his question would be from the other side of criminality.
Thank you very much. But my question is about guilt. You stated that it is no question in the book that the murder was not morally correct. But in fact, there are two murders. There's a murder of the old, wicked lady, very wealthy, and Raskolnikov wants to murder her to help his sister, who needs the money. But then he also murders the niece, who is innocent. So let us say that he had not murdered the niece, but only the wicked old lady who does not deserve to live, but the money can help his sister. Would he then have felt guilt under the novel? Or is it a part of the guilt that the innocent lady was killed? Does it mean that you can morally kill the old lady, but not the innocent niece, young lady? For me, that was always also a moral question for Dostoyevsky. Thank you.
It's a good comment, I think. Yeah. I think.
There was another question in the front.
There's a question over here at the back.
Somebody is waiting there.
Just at the back.
Look, yeah.
Good evening. Like any good university student, I haven't done the required reading. So I guess this is more an engagement with the idea of crime and punishment. And I'm just throwing this up against a novel like Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold. My question to you, it is from you and of Dostoevsky as well, is who commits the crime? Because in the Chronicle, you know, the reader's asked, is it really just the individual that's responsible? Is there a wider responsibility? So in your opinion, who's the actual person who commits the crime?
God?
No, well, I mean, God may be a criminal, I don't know. But I think the issue is one that we have actually very much discussed here. Yes. That the agent might be a singular agent, but we cannot ignore, I think the courts don't ignore either, and the church in a way tends now not to ignore the circumstances.
This is in fact one of the themes of the whole Crime and Punishment series, because this morning we had a session on the Bangla whodunit, where we had the idea of what did middle-class Bengali detectives seek in their search for truth. Later on we have a famous policeman writer, we have somebody who's written about a crime of passion. We have, if you go through all the crime and punishment sessions in the next few days, maybe you'll be able to tell us the answer or get a little closer to the answer.
I've just got one question. Having lived in India for the last 8 years, one of the things that really worries me is the level of criminal records amongst the leaders. And as I think that's one of the reasons why we're discussing this theme today here at this very important festival, because India is becoming one of the most powerful countries in the world, and yet more than 50% of the leaders have criminal records. What happens in a...
Money? We need another mic.
What has happened to a country that has deemed that acceptable, that is okay to have people leading the country who actually have committed crimes, and they're not the crimes of freedom fighting, they're the crimes of elbowing themselves to the front. And if politics plays out and Modi wins, what does that mean for one of the most powerful nations in the world?
I think the fact that we have a reprehensible justice system, and you must read Amartya Sen's book, The Idea of Justice, because he says there are two ways of looking at justice. One is process and the other is fairness. The fact that these guys go to court, they remain on trial, their cases linger for 30 years, and they use that as a pretext or as an excuse for remaining in politics. We don't have swift justice. But I want to touch very quickly on something that reflects on how criminality is viewed extraneously. Look at the jury system that was created in the world. India had a jury system till about 1956 or I think 1960, actually till the Nanavati trials.
Okay, yes, indeed.
And then we junked the jury system. Today in America, you have lawyers who are able to fix and determine the pattern that the jury must be of in order to give justice or work for their client. So I think that is also a pernicious way of telling you that criminality is always contextual to the society it exists in at that given time and place.
Particularly since the whole jury system initially, if I'm right, was on the basis that you should have, 12 men, 12 women, free and whatever.
Yeah.
So that this idea of, interviewing juries, now that they do it they say, in order to create a jury of people who are not influenced or influenceable. Now, whether that happens or not is the issue. But I think why was the jury system got rid of here in India?
Are there any Indian lawyers here?
Who could answer that?
Actually, today's a Friday, so they must be just pleading their clients in the Supreme Court or the High Court somewhere. From what I remember, during the Nanavati trials, there was so much of public outcry in favor of Nanavati that they believed that if there was a jury system that would start the whole process of indictment, Nanavati would never be committed. It's another matter that he finally did. So that was one of the reasons I think that the jury system in India was abolished.
I've got a nod from the venue head. We've been told that this is one of the most precisely run festivals in the world. And I thank all the audiences and I thank all of you here for kicking off this larger conversation today. We began with a specific session and here to the larger issues of crime and punishment.
Thank you again, Suhel Seth, Homi Bhabha.